Welcome. My name is Tarun Khanna, and I run the South Asia Institute. We're very pleased that Central Square Foundation has been the catalyst for this event, really to help us brainstorm some of the K through 12 education issues. We've got a full agenda, basically in three parts, as I understand. Karthik Muralidharan, who is a friend of Harvard and a graduate of Harvard and studies education in India primarily, as I understand, is in California and is going to Skype in and give us an overview based on some of the work that he's done on issues related through K through 12 education. I believe I'm supposed to moderate that discussion. When Karthik comes online, we'll ask him how long he plans to speak, and then we can have more of a moderated discussion of sorts. Our second panel, so we've got a list of eminent people who know incomparably more than I do about education, or the practice of education. And they are divided into two panels. Ashish Dhawan from the Central Square Foundation will moderate one, and I'll moderate the second. And I think there's time for brainstorming and so on after that. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Karthik. Karthik, can you hear us? It sounds like he can hear us because his lips are moving.
Oh, that's right. I was on mute. Okay.
Yes. That sounds like the Karthik I know, with that generally hyperactive and intellectually engaged. So welcome, Karthik. How long do you plan on speaking so that we can...
So I think, so we have an hour for the session, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, so I think I'll plan for about half an hour and then
okay,
leave
wonderful.
about half the time for discussion.
Wonderful. So I'm going to step off the stage and leave it to you, and then half an hour from now, you can see the audience?
Yes, I see a lot of familiar faces. I see Tarun, I see Ashish, I thought I saw Fernando, I thought I saw Felipe standing at the back. But
okay.
I don't see Felipe anymore. But yes, lots of familiar
He's
faces.
waving, right.
Yes.
So at some point I will, if you in your characteristic enthusiasm run over, I will rudely stop you. Everybody knows your characteristic enthusiasm. So with that permission from you, why don't you get started? Thank you very much for doing it.
Perfect. So let me first see if I can share this PowerPoint across. Just give me 1 second. I need to share my screen for this. Okay. Are you seeing the screen?
It's coming. Yes. Yes.
Okay, excellent. Sorry for not being there in person, but there are these minor things like teaching in a class of 200 kids this evening, and grateful to have the technology that allows me to do this at low carbon footprint and still kind of be part of this meeting. So I guess what I'm going to do is, as Tarun mentioned, I've been working on education-related research in India for a long time now. And a lot of this came together last year when I wrote a review paper for the Government of India as kind of a background paper for the 12th five-year plan, summarizing a lot of this research, some of it my own, a lot of it by others, and kind of just getting us to a point of what have we learned in kind of 10 years of careful academic empirical research on education in India. But I think the other reason for this paper is that, as you'll see, in many ways the policy priorities and the policy environment does not seem to have reflected what we've learned from a lot of this research. And so in many ways, for those of us who've been working in this area, a lot of this is familiar, but it's a way of bringing things together and kind of then teeing it up over to a policy and practitioner audience to see what they would do with this. So can you hear me clearly there? Am I too fast, too slow, just right? Just right? Just right. Okay. So a couple of other caveats up front is that because this was a document that was focusing on the 12th plan for the government, I'm not talking that much about private schools and kind of private initiative in this particular presentation. But as I've indicated to Tom and Ashish and Tarun, I'll be more than happy to tee up those topics when we talk in discussion. Okay, so let's get started. Now, the background to a lot of this, as you guys know, is there's been enormous increases in education spending, which have translated into significant improvements, at least in terms of school enrollment. So we've got over 95% of kids now enrolled in primary school. But again, as most of you probably know, the problem now is on the quality side, where the latest numbers from USSR are just not just depressing, but absolutely mind blowing. In that 60% of kids aged 6 to 14 don't read at a second grade level, and if anything, the time trend seems to be slightly negative. But there doesn't seem to be any indication that this is improving. Now, one thing to highlight is that these Pratham surveys are done based on representative household surveys. So these are not biased by who is in fact attending school. So it's not the case that you're bringing in a bunch of first generation learners into school and that's bringing down your average. These numbers are coming from household surveys, okay? Now, the policy environment, of course, has been focusing on increasing the budget, and there have been significant allocations to education, first under the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan and now under RTE, and even with dedicated education taxes and cesses designed to raise resources for education. But as you can see on the left-hand side of that, none of this seems to be translating much into improved learning outcomes. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today comes from a research program in Andhra Pradesh that we've run for over 5 years. And Tarun in the audience there, in fact, worked a little bit on this in the past couple of years. And one of the things you see here is that we can measure not just levels of learning, but measure trajectories of learning and look at kids going over time. And what you see is that it's not just that the levels are low, but the trajectories are really flat, right? So the way to read this picture is it's tracking what is the probability of a typical child in a typical school in rural Andhra Pradesh getting a single-digit addition question right that has some basic carryover that you can't do on just count on your fingers. And you see that not only is it the case that only 2/3 of kids can do that at the end of grade 5, it's also the case that 1/3 of them can in fact do it in grade 2. And so what that means is that the learning trajectory between 2 and 5 is remarkably flat, that even when you spend an extra year in school, less than 20% of kids who don't know something are likely to learn it from spending an extra year in school. Okay, so this is kind of the backdrop in terms of facts. And there's now an increasing body of research, I'm kind of just showing slides from one of them, that shows that we've got a lot of research showing that education is a key component of aggregate growth rates. But in the past, when we had data just in school enrollments, you used to get these positive correlations with school enrollment. But once you also include data on quality of schooling, which in this case is comparable PISA scores, it looks like most of the action is shifting from quantity of schooling to quality of schooling. So we know we have a problem if we're just focusing on getting the inputs right and getting kind of years of schooling up without focusing on learning outcomes. Okay, so the bottom line, we all know this, is that the skills deficits in developing countries are due to a lot more than just deficits in enrollment and attainment, is that what do these kids know when they're in school, okay? And so what I'm going to do in the next 10 or 15 minutes is try and summarize, what we've learned from this body of work in the past decade or so, go through things reasonably quickly, and if anybody has more detailed questions on specific studies, I'm happy to I'm happy to take those at the end. So if you look at where the spending goes, over 90% of education spending essentially goes to 3 classes of inputs. There are the school inputs in terms of infrastructure. Just give me a second. There's infrastructure, there is teachers, both in terms of quality and quantity, and there's what you spend directly on students. So if you look at the evidence in infrastructure, which is clearly been a large focus of what the government has done, the amount of time spent on making sure schools have toilets or that they have buildings or that they have electricity has been enormous, and we do have work to show based on All India panel data at the village level that there have been very large improvements in many metrics of school quality. So schools are 4 times more likely to have a midday meal program, about twice as likely to have a toilet. So all of these improvements have taken place in the period 2003 to 2010. So this is the good news. The not so good news is that there's really no correlation between these improvements in infrastructure and improvements in any set of outcomes, in particular learning outcomes, but we're not even seeing very big effects on enrollment or attendance, though those are slightly positive. And now, it's much harder to do experimental randomized controlled studies of school infrastructure because these things have to be evaluated over the depreciation life cycle of the capital good. But there's one experimental study done by Lee Linden and co-authors at school libraries in Karnataka where they find no effect. And I think, in some sense, more convincing in a representative sample is what we have in this 5 years in Andhra Pradesh, because we're not just looking at libraries, we're looking at buildings, toilets, electricity, compound walls, a whole set of things. And because we've got 5 years of data, you can look at the value added and look at how much learning trajectories are improving each year and correlate that with the changes in infrastructure and the improvements that you've seen in these schools. And over 5 years, we document considerable improvements on the right-hand side in a lot of these school infrastructure variables, but we're not seeing any significant correlation with outcomes. So it kind of raises the question about what is going on, right? So how do we interpret this stuff? Is it really the case that building better schools and improving the quality of classrooms and providing better infrastructure, that this does not matter? I don't think we can conclude that. And rather, the way I interpret this is to say that infrastructure might be necessary, but by no means sufficient in terms of getting learning outcomes. So if you want to think about what could be going on, the most basic possibility is that maybe infrastructure makes schools nicer, but what really matters is actual teaching and learning. So there's this nice paper by Fabian Waldinger in a completely different context, but he's looking at universities in post-World War II Germany. And what he looks at is he looks at the fact that Allied bombings during World War II create kind of random variation in terms of destroying physical infrastructure. But at the same time, you also have random variation in kind of reduction of human capital, because the larger the number of Jewish faculty in these universities, the more of a human capital shock they suffered in terms of faculty leaving. And what he finds is 10 years after the war, the universities have recovered from the loss of physical capital, but 50 years afterwards, they still have not recovered from the loss of human capital. Okay, so it's quite possible that the infrastructure is nice, but that's not what really matters. Okay. A second possibility is that infrastructure is getting built but not getting used. So one of the things we see in our data in Andhra Pradesh is that we have matched data between households and schools, and you see that in 75% of the cases where the school has a toilet, the children are still going outside. And we know this because we have the household data. And then you go to the schools and see what's happening, and what's going on is, yes, you're building a toilet, but either there's no water or there's nobody to clean the toilet, and so the teachers are happier to lock up the toilet than have it be used. And you get similar things with libraries, where schools will show you proudly that they have these books like a main, but they're all locked up because they don't want to lose the books, and so you have the infrastructure, but it's not getting used. And the final possibility, like I said, it is possible that this infrastructure does have an impact, that you need to measure the impact over a 20-year lifespan, which is the depreciation life cycle of the capital good, and that the annual impact that we measure in any given year is too small to pick up statistically, but that the aggregate impact is going to be positive. And so I personally think, that this is perhaps a non-trivial part of what's going on, but it does suggest, especially in the light of other interventions that have large gains each year, that the infrastructure by no means is sufficient in terms of getting improvements in learning outcomes. Okay, so it's kind of unfortunate that I have to do these things very fast, but that's kind of the summary. Now let's go look at teachers, which is the single largest line item in terms of expenditure. And there's three main dimensions in which there's been an attempt to improve the quality and quantity of teachers. There's been hiring of more teachers, so there's reduction in class size, there's improvements in teacher training, and then there's improvements in teacher salary. So all of these three things are supposed to improve the overall quality of the teaching workforce. So the first thing, and this is a result that's very similar in India as we see in the US, is that there's just absolutely no evidence whatsoever to suggest that teachers with formal teacher training are any more effective at improving student learning than untrained ones. This is something we see in multiple studies and multiple data sets. Now, of course, this is again not to say that training per se is useless. It just means that the formal teacher training credential that we hold as kind of a stepping stone to getting into teaching profession does not seem to be correlated in any meaningful way with the effectiveness in the classroom as measured by teacher value add. Okay, there's mixed evidence on PTR, which is pupil-teacher ratio or class size. In India, the unit of policy description is the PTR. So I don't know if Abhijit is there yet, but they've got work showing in the context of class size reductions that there was not much effect there. We've got evidence showing that there are positive effects of reducing PTR, but it's really not that much. And so the main story here is that reductions in class size do help, but are a remarkably cost-ineffective way of getting improvements relative to other interventions you could have. The other important thing about class size, which is not currently reflected in the policy dialogue, is we're seeing a fair bit of evidence that class sizes matter much more in the younger grades, that they matter a lot more in grade 1 and 2, and less in older grades. Whereas the policy environment right now prescribes uniform PTRs at the school level and doesn't specify differentiated class sizes by grade. So one possible mechanism for why why reductions in class size might not be getting you large improvements is that we've now got a lot of evidence showing that when you reduce the pupil-teacher ratio, you're getting a significant increase in teacher absence, okay, which is kind of perverse. But it looks like what's going on is that when you have more teachers, they're able to log roll the absence. And we've seen this in multiple places. We've seen this experimentally when we provide schools with extra teachers, that the absence in the control schools goes up, the absence in the treatment schools of other teachers goes up. And we also see this in our All India panel data. Okay, now, again, this is not to suggest that the teacher training doesn't matter at all, okay? So if we're not finding an effect of teacher training on learning outcomes, there's two possible mechanisms. The first is that the content of the training is useless. The second is that there is some useful content in the training, but that there's no incentive for the teachers to use that training in a day-to-day setting because there's nothing in their work environment that is measuring or rewarding outcomes. So what we see is, we do see some evidence that the second issue is at play, because if you look at our experiments on performance pay, you don't find any effectiveness of training in the regular control schools. But if you look at the performance pay schools, the more trained teachers in those schools consistently seem to do better. So what it suggests is that training provides you the capacity to be a better teacher, but there doesn't seem to be any reason to use this capacity in a business as usual setting, because there's nothing in your day-to-day life of a professional life of a teacher that is recognizing and rewarding performance. So the last class of inputs is going to be student inputs, and there's two sets of inputs here. There's textbook, school level inputs and materials, and again we're seeing very little impact of these inputs on learning outcomes. Now one possible mechanism here is something we find in our work in Andhra Pradesh, where what you see is that in a 2-year experimental evaluation of a school grant program, where the money was spent on books and writing materials and workbooks and stationery, you see nice, significant positive effects of providing the schools with these materials after 1 year, but there's no effect after 2 years. So the question is what's going on, and in fact, in the second year, you give the money again, okay? So there's 2 rounds of money. It's not just that you give the money once and then it goes away. There's continued money. So what's going on is we rule out a bunch of other explanations, and it looks like what's going on is that there's household re-optimization, right? Which is where in the first year, the grant arrives and it's unexpected. And so it comes 2 months into the school year after the households have already bought the materials they need. But in the second year, they know the money is coming, and so they just reduce their own spending accordingly. So even though there's a policy provision of inputs, it's not leading to a net increase because there's a corresponding offset in what the household is doing. Okay, now we can come back and talk about what that means. It doesn't mean that households don't care about education. It just means that in the long run, all of these inputs are fungible and the effects will converge to the income elasticity of test scores. Now, and then the other big program that the government has invested a lot of money in are the school feeding programs, where you're providing midday meals, and the allocations on this, the budgetary allocations are enormous. And you see some evidence, some positive effects on enrollment, but again, we're not seeing any effects on test scores. And one possible mechanism is just like this household re-optimization in the previous case, we see a fair bit of evidence that there might be teacher time substitution. So if you look at teacher time use diaries, teachers in public schools in AP report spending significantly more time, overseeing and managing the school feeding process relative to, say, teachers in private schools. Okay, so the bottom line here is to highlight that there is no free lunch. I mean, that when you go in with an intervention, you cannot think of that intervention in isolation. You really have to think about how that intervention is going to lead other players in the system to re-optimize their behavior and what that might mean in terms of translating your inputs into the outcomes you care about. So let's kind of, so at this level it starts getting quite depressing, which is you say, wait, most of what the government is doing, when I think about policy, I think about, hey, let me build more schools, let me build better classrooms, let me provide better facilities, let me provide better teachers, let me provide materials. And the evidence is kind of saying that most of these things just don't seem to matter. Now, this is not to say it doesn't matter, but at least seems to say that it doesn't seem to be effective in raising learning outcomes. So the good news, on the other hand, is we also have evidence of things that work. So it's not going to be all nihilistic here and saying that nothing works. And in particular, the class of interventions that has proven to be consistently effective in multiple settings is supplemental remedial instruction that is delivered by local community volunteers or modestly paid local community teachers, but that is delivered at the level of learning of the child. So the bigger picture point here is that the pedagogy and the textbooks might have been optimized for a time with a lot fewer learners. And in particular, these textbooks were written at a time when half your population was not in the schooling system. And it does, if you go back to that learning trajectory picture I showed you, the theory that's most consistent with is the fact that if you have not learned basic reading and basic kind of arithmetic and counting by grade 3, you don't learn it even if you spend more time in school, because the textbook is already significantly above the level of where you are. And if Abhijit is there, he'll talk more about this. This is something that he and Esther have propounded a fair bit as kind of a theory that's most consistent, with what we're seeing from a lot of this evidence. So a fundamental challenge in pedagogy is how do you handle the variation in ability levels in the classroom? So for the professors out there, you know that the single hardest thing to do when you teach is deciding where you're going to pitch the material. Are you going to pitch it at the middle, or are you going to pitch it to keep the most engaged kids engaged, or are you going to try and pitch it at a level that allows everybody to keep pace? So this is really hard, okay? So, and I think I'll talk later about governance and teacher absence, but the point here to highlight is that even a good teacher in the Indian school system defines his quote-unquote goodness by whether they complete the portion, whether they complete the syllabus. And if the lessons are mapped into weekly instruction plans, regardless of where the kids are, that might explain why you're getting very little impact on learning outcomes, even though you have more resources and more teachers and more kids in school, because the material is simply being transacted at a level above where their current level of learning is. So you have several studies now showing that untrained or modestly trained local volunteers implementing remedial instruction programs can have a large positive effect on test scores. So Esther, Abhijit, and Pratham have now done multiple studies in multiple settings in Bombay, in Ahmedabad, in Bihar, in Uttaranchal, in UP, and then there's another set of studies done by the Nandi Foundation in Andhra Pradesh, and all of these studies are finding really large gains in learning outcomes from relatively modest and inexpensive supplemental remedial instruction programs. So, and it's important to keep in mind that this was not expensive because you weren't paying civil service teacher wages, but the teachers who are typically doing this teaching are paid about a tenth of what a civil servant government teacher is paid. And so, which makes it extremely cost effective and scalable, and we'll come back to that in a second. Now, the other thing I want to spend a little bit of time on is technology, which is everybody's favorite panacea, right? This is how we're going to solve the problem in terms of both instruction and scalability. So theoretically, there's a lot of evidence, right? Or there's a lot of promise to think that technology can have a big effect. But the empirical evidence is really quite mixed. And the main point we're learning from the research on technology is that the details really, really matter, okay? So, for example, Lee Linden has these 2 studies of computer-aided instruction in mathematics. And in one set, the instruction is provided in a supplemental form after school hours. And in the other case, it's provided substituting for what was happening in the class. And what you see is that in the first case, you get a large positive significant effect on test scores. In the second case, you get a negative effect, right? So test scores actually go down. And so it raises the question that maybe what's going on is it's not the technology, but just the instructional time, and that if you're not careful about what exactly you're crowding out, that technology interventions could in fact even be negative. So it really highlights the importance of getting into the black box of exactly what your intervention is doing and what it's substituting in and what it's crowding out, okay? So Abhijit and Esther and Lee and Sean have a paper, the Balsaki paper also features a computer-aided instruction program, and they find that it had a positive effect, but that it was not nearly as cost-effective as some of the other things. And then this is from a completely different context, but given kind of, the blanket approach of Akash tablets for all as the panacea that people think is going to solve our education problems, it's useful to keep in mind this very careful, large randomized evaluation done by the IDB in Peru of the one laptop per child program, where basically the per child computer ratio went up from 0.12 to about 1.18. So literally every child had a computer, and they found almost no effects on test scores. Now, they do find some positive effects on other outcomes, but these are extremely modest compared to how expensive the interventions are. Okay, so now this is not to say that technology is not kind of a potential part of the answer. There's an enormous amount of potential, but I think we are way, way behind where we need to be in terms of research and understanding before we're in a position to try and scale these things up. Okay, so there's a lot of potential, but a lot more experimentation and evaluation is needed, and we can talk more about this in the end. So finally, the last piece of what I'm going to talk about is governance, okay? And what you see is that one part of the problem is pedagogy, the other is governance. So at a most visceral level, 25% of teachers in India are absent on any given day, and less than half of them are teaching. This is based on data in 2003. Now, the bad news is that we go back to these same schools. We went back in 2010, 7 years later. So between 2003 and 2010, you document massive changes in infrastructure, massive improvements in a whole bunch of inputs, teacher salaries, class sizes, but the absence levels have fallen very modestly. It's only fallen about 2.5% from 26.3 to 23.7. And among all the changes we see, the one thing that really seems to matter is just good old-fashioned monitoring. So nothing fancy, just was your school visited by an inspector in the past 3 months? And because this is panel data, we can be a lot more confident that this is not just a correlation. Now, it's not an experiment, but it's at least less likely to be confounded by the omitted variable problems we normally worry about. Okay, so let me then talk about contractual structure. So in particular, the use of contract teachers who are hired locally at the village level and are different from civil service teachers in many, many ways, okay? So they are less educated, they're less trained, they're paid a lot less, and they're less experienced. So you can imagine that this is highly controversial. All right, sorry, I'm just gonna... Okay, and proponents, it's very hard, right? You're used to standing and lecturing. I've never sat down and done a talk, so I think you can see a little bit of me in a corner of your screen. I'm now just standing at my desk, and so what you're seeing is that the proponents of contract teachers point to their cost effectiveness, their superior incentives, their ties to the community, the fact that they are from the same village. Whereas opponents would argue that the contract teachers are unlikely to improve learning outcomes because they're not trained, that their motivation levels are low because salary is low, and that it's possible for these positions to be captured by local elites in villages because they're not appointed through civil service procedures. So the data is pretty unambiguous in this, right? That there's no evidence to support the view that the contract teachers are less effective. And if anything, what we're seeing is that the contract teachers are potentially even more effective, but even without that, it's almost unambiguously the case that they're at least as effective. There's multiple studies now that show this, and the important point to keep in mind is that the contract teacher costs 1/5 or 1/6 of the civil service teacher. And so the correct comparison is not one civil service teacher versus one contract teacher, but it's one civil service teacher versus 5 contract teachers, okay? And I'm not going to talk much about private schools today, but basically that's kind of what the private schools do, right? Which is they pay market clearing wage. So it's not the fact that these So one view is that the contract teachers are exploited, but what the data shows is, if anything, it's just that there's massive rents in the civil service job because the contract teachers are getting paid even more than what the market wage is, okay? And so if anything, right, so all the point estimates suggest that they're more effective, and on a cost effectiveness perspective, they're dramatically more effective. Okay, so now one thing is we don't know what the exact mechanism is because the contract teacher is different in multiple ways, right? It could be the incentive, it could because of a renewable contract, it could be the connection to the local area, it could be that there's much lower costs of attending because you're in the same village. But regardless, I think the big picture here is enormously important because we have a model of teacher hiring and staffing that says let's hire the best teachers in a statewide labor market, but then assign them to villages where they don't want to go. And so what happens is that these teachers all live in district headquarters or block headquarters. They live about 12 to 15 kilometers away from the school. Their own kids are attending private schools, and the absence rates are high. Whereas the teachers who are less educated and less trained but belong to the same community appear to be at least as effective, if not more, and are dramatically more cost effective. Okay? Now the last piece of this is, I'm going to go through this fast since I'm running out of time, okay, is a set of studies now, just showing how even very modest amounts of performance-linked pay for teachers can have very large positive effects, okay? So now, the reason I'm not going to talk too much about this is from an implementation capacity. I think, we're not anywhere where we need to be in terms of implementing systems like this in the public system, but it's really more of a larger point of state capacity that the government keeps on expanding the rights and the entitlements of what it is expecting the state to deliver without any commensurate investment in state capacity. And state capacity is not just about staffing, it's about whether your frontline employees have the incentives to do what they're supposed to do. And if they're not showing up to work, you've got a problem, okay? So we've got multiple studies. So Esther Duflo and co-authors and Rima, if she's there, have studies showing that very simple monitoring improved attendance dramatically, and particularly when the pay was linked to the number of days you were attending. And our studies in Andhra Pradesh over a 2-year and a 5-year horizon find dramatic positive effects of even very small amounts of performance pay. So again, the point here is to just get a proof of concept across that the returns to getting incentives right in the public sector can be enormous. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up in the next 5 minutes, and we can talk mostly, I'm going to go through this quickly and not, let's see, let me kind of, let me lose the animation and you can just kind of see what my main recommendations are, and then we can move this to the discussion. So the first point here, which should be pretty obvious, is just that learning outcomes has to be a central goal of education policy. And as Ashish and Central Square and others know, this is not the case, and that's why they had this press release recently at 3 years of the RTE talking about the centrality of learning outcomes. So it's kind of ridiculous that you still don't have this. But there's a deep-seated institutional set of biases for thinking that testing is stressful for children, that there's too much testing, and that the government cannot be held accountable for outcomes and only for inputs. And I think the answers to all of these are pretty straightforward. And most important is the fact that because there's a history of high-stakes testing, there's a history of a lot of stress associated with these tests. So what you want to do is move to low-stakes testing of what we call assessment for learning as opposed to assessment of learning, and use these early stage diagnostic tests to make sure that you're helping kids kind of catch up and stay where they need to be, okay? The second main thing here is thinking about curricular reform more broadly, and the importance of targeting instruction at the level of learning. So I think it's useful to note that the historical role of education in a place like India was not so much to build universal human capital, but to select gifted kids for state and the clergy, right? So for those of you who kind of think about the IITs and think about how this is kind of one of the great institutions in the world, it is, but you could argue that the real miracle of the IITs is the fact that they maintain the integrity of the selection procedure, right? So if you get the top 0.01% of a billion-person distribution, those kids are going to do great things regardless of what you add value in terms of what you do in school. Now, some people might say the same about Harvard, but I won't go there, okay? But the larger point here, right, is that the history of these education systems has not been about adding value at all parts of the distribution. So if you go to a village today and talk to a teacher who's been there for 25 years, that teacher is most likely to remember the one kid from that village who made it big 20 years ago and saying, we had this one really smart kid who made it to the IAS, or we had this one really smart kid who went to engineering, went to the US, and he came back and he helped us build this room in this building, so we had one great guy. And so it's not a system that is kind of teaching itself to value moving kids from illiteracy to functional literacy, or moving kids from functional literacy to kind of secondary school level competences. And so there's a very real risk that the textbooks and the curricula are just completely overambitious, and that trying to do too much may be leading to doing too little, okay? So the larger project here would be thinking about rethinking the curriculum to begin with, but a more modest set of intermediate goals would be to say that let's at least try and devote dramatic amount of remedial and additional resources to kids who start out with disadvantages. Okay, so I'm not even talking about some of the other things we see in our longitudinal data. But one thing that's very clear in our 5-year tracking of kids in Andhra Pradesh as they go through the schooling system is that there are very large inequalities by socioeconomic status when you enter the schooling system in grade 1. And those inequalities just keep growing over time, right? So you start off unequal and that inequality keeps growing. So if you think about if you think about the social justice narrative of universal education, you're kind of really missing the point by getting these kids to school and having them drop out because they haven't learned anything. So targeting additional resources for supplemented, targeted instruction at initial levels of schooling is a policy that could improve both equity as well as efficiency, okay? Because it's moving resources to those who need it more and improves efficiency because it reduces the variance in the classroom and it helps the teachers teach all kids better. Okay, so point 3 in all of this is that where are these additional resources going to come from? And this is where the contract teacher results become really important. So I'm not going to talk through like the details of the policy of what this would look like because there are other papers by Land Pritchett and others that talk about this. But the main point is that a lot of the objections about the use of contract teachers can be overcome by building contract teachers into a long-term career ladder, where you hire all new teachers as contract teachers and you promote to regular positions based on performance over a period of time. So think about this as a tenure track model as opposed to a permanent adjunct model, right? So we don't like the idea of a permanent 2-tier teaching class, but thinking about using local resources in early years of teaching and training can be a really cost-effective way of providing the supplemental instruction. So in fact, I'm working on a detailed policy note on this, which specifies a set of more details on this. And then the final part is kind of investing in governance. So again, I'm not going to do this in great detail. The point is that teacher quality really, really matters. And right now, there is no correlation between the observable traits on which you select teachers and their actual effectiveness, okay? So work by Raj Chetty and others shows that the long-term value of a good teacher in early grades is enormous. And so being able to select better teachers early on is going to have large impacts. Now, the problem is right now you have high barriers to entry, but once you're in the system, you're there for life. And the markers of barriers to entry are very poor correlates of performance. And so what you want to be doing is the opposite, right? Which is reducing the entry barriers to joining teaching because training is not equal to quality. But then you want to raise the retention barrier so that you're only allowed to continue if you show a certain minimum effectiveness, okay? Now, we can again talk through the details of all of this. The bottom line is, I'm just going to summarize. The paper has a lot of discussion of political economy, which I'm not going to do now, and we'll save that for discussion. But there were 2 main points, right? One in the context of the 12th plan and our history in India of centrally sponsored schemes, which end up being extremely straitjacketed, is that it's essential to provide states with a lot more autonomy in budgets to innovate and to facilitate evaluation and replication. So, everything I've talked about so far is a set of strategic pointers for where policy needs to go, but there's nothing in what I've said that gives you tactical guidance on how exactly you're going to implement this. And that's where it makes sense to provide states and districts with a lot of autonomy in terms of how they're going to implement these ideas, and then thinking about using these states as laboratories for innovation and experimentation that allows different political leaders and different coalitions to try different things and basically let competitive federalism be your guiding principle as opposed to a straitjacket from Delhi. Okay, so to wrap up, business as usual is not working. You can start by doing the easy things first, and these recommendations are in some sense an increasing order of difficulty, right? There's really no good reason to not make the 12th plan focus on learning outcomes, and the good news is that this paper was written before the final 12th plan, and it did get a fair bit of traction with the senior leadership, so a lot of this language now is in the final version of the 12th plan. So the challenge now is how do we move to implementation? And that's where I think, we all come in at different levels. So, we engage with governments, we engage with civil society actors, we engage in building systemic capacity. So I think my last slide is what are the opportunities for involvement for innovators and funders is kind of thinking about what are the ways in which one can implement this strategic vision, and you can play a highly leveraged role in supporting innovative ideas for achieving these goals, evaluating them, sharing results, and supporting scale-up. So at the most basic levels, how do we create high quality independent measurement and reporting of learning outcomes in a scalable way? We can't do that right now. I mean, the Pratham model still works as kind of a sample-based nationwide exercise, and maybe that's the best we can do. But if what you want to do is measure and report learning trajectories of students and design customized learning plans, then we need much, much better and independent and reliable ways of measurement. You can think about innovative ways of crowdsourcing data on daily school performance. You could think about supporting state and district level leadership capacity and using data for better management, given how woeful the management capacity is in these places. And there's a lot of other entry points for third parties and funders, which I'm happy to then talk about like in discussion. So Tarun, I'm sure you thought this would never happen, but I think I'm on time.
Hear me? Yes? Yeah. So Karthik managed to pull a fast one on me. He said he was going to stop 3 times in the last 10 minutes and kept on. So no, you're not on time, but nonetheless, it was very exciting. And thank you for that nice overview. Just a transition comment. It seems that the idea of, this is a general governance issue in India, many poor countries, but in India in particular, that policy is made or it's very much input-based efforts as opposed to allocating resources on the basis of outcomes, which is what you're advocating ultimately. So it's not limited to education, of course. I don't want to say anything more. I just want to open it up. What's the best way to do this? Would you mind just coming up to the mic, whoever has anything to say? Yeah, please. Can you just say who you are real quick?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Hi, my name is Swati, and I'm a student of International Education Policy here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And my question to you is, I've been engaging with this idea for a long time in my mind, is what are the policy implications of your finding around the fact that teacher training does not really have an impact on learning levels? Would the implication be that we should just explore alternative ways of teacher accreditation and just recruit anyone and everyone, whether they have required training or not, just based on a test or any other alternative ways? Or could a recommendation be to actually speak to the Ministry of Human Resource Development and ask them to revive the National Council for Teacher Education, which was scrapped 2 years ago because of a corrupt chairperson? And I used to work on the Right to Education Act in the ministry, and I know that there's one director in the entire ministry which handles the entire portfolio. And there is absolutely no debate that I hear on the quality of teacher training institutions, 90% of which are in the private space, 10% in the government, all fly by night really. And why is it that your research does not indicate that we need to make that really active? Because everything that I've heard this year from the perspective of comparative research is that an education system is really only as good as its teachers. So all of these advanced countries, whether it's Finland, Singapore, Korea, they all significantly invest in their teacher training institutions. And why in India are we not focusing that? Thank you.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So thanks. That's a great question. And by the way, let me, now that I've seen you in person, apologize in person for not coming in March for that invitation. So that time I was on a flight, so I couldn't even do this. But no, I think, those are both very good questions and comments. And my main answer is that they're not mutually exclusive, right? And I think, as an economist, I have spent less time thinking about what does optimal teacher training look like, right? My time has been spent evaluating whether the trained teacher as currently entering the system, is effective or not, right? Now, so clearly this suggests one of two things, right? One part of this is that you dramatically want to improve the quality of teacher training, right? And that's certainly the route that people like the Azim Premji Foundation are taking, right? So APF has now invested 10 years of engagement in the education space in India, right? And having kind of looked at the system in great detail, they have come to the conclusion that what they really need to be doing is focusing on teacher training, right? And they're putting a huge amount of resources in trying to improve the quality of teacher training. Now, I think the political economy that you describe is in fact, I think, what is going on, which is you have a requirement for a trained teacher, right? But then you don't have any enforcement of standards. And so a lot of these poor quality teacher training institutes are perhaps controlled by politicians themselves. And so when you do the teacher eligibility test right now, I think you found about 10% of the current stock of teachers are able to pass that exam. So clearly, by any objective standard of what a good teacher is, the system system doesn't have them. So one way of just interpreting my results is to say it doesn't say anything that training is not good. It just says that the current status quo, is completely broken. But then that implies something else, which is if it is broken, then let's not make that an absolute mandatory requirement, right? For somebody to enter teaching, because you might keep out a lot of really good people that way, right? So what I'm suggesting is, and in some sense, that's why I said both of your ideas are not mutually exclusive, right? So at one level, you want a supply-side initiative of increasing the quality of teacher training, but at another level, you want a demand-side set of interventions that measure teacher effectiveness on the job and not just by paper credentials, because we know that a lot of these paper credentials are in fact worthless, right? So those are not mutually exclusive. And the third thing I want to mention is in terms of rethinking training itself. I think, having spent a year on the faculty at Hugsy, right? As I'm relative to economists, I'm more conversant with cultures in education schools, right? And I think the point is a lot of the training that happens in most education schools is not so much about classroom management and pedagogy, right? A lot of it ends up being about history and theory and philosophy and sociology of education in terms of the role of education in society, as opposed to actually training people to be a better teacher, right? So there might be a sense in which, so that's one comment. The second set of comments has to do with classroom versus, practical versus classroom training, right? So the way you might want to reimagine teacher training is the way you do medical training, right? Which is you get a certain amount of classroom instruction, but then you're really taught when you're doing the rounds. You're taught in the classroom. You're taught in the working setting. So maybe what you want to do is modularize teacher training so that instead of having a 1 or 2 year course after which you're certified to teach for life, you think about this as a 4-year process whereby you do 3 months of training every summer. You do 3 months in a training, 9 months in class, 3 months in training. So there's ways, I think, to get more creative about how we think about training. But that's, I think, why it's important to open up alternative pathways to certification and study these, because we don't know at this point about what is the right model. Right?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Natasha Wariku. I'm assistant professor at HGSC. Thanks for your hi. Thanks for your great, really interesting overview. I was really interested in your findings about the contract teachers. Because if you look at the research in the U.S., there's a lot of really mixed evidence about class size reduction and whether that improves student outcomes. Also, the research on paraprofessionals. So, I sort of see them as, the teaching assistants, kind of somewhat similar to your contract teachers, not as trained, but often from kind of local environments, et cetera. And their impact on student outcomes also is kind of mixed. So I'm just curious if you could speak a little about what you think is going on. I don't know if you have seen any kind of qualitative studies about what happens with these contract teachers and how that's different from what's going on in the more traditional classroom setting, and what is the mechanism that is leading to these differences? So I'll be curious to hear about that.
So that's a great question, and I think So two important contextual differences, right? So one is, so in fact, I guess it's easier for me if I can see the person who asked the question. So but as in the previous case, I could see her in her seat. So I think, so two important things to keep in mind. One is that the contract teachers in the Indian setting are not assistants to regular teachers, but they kind of have their own classrooms, right? Because what you have in the Indian primary education system is a trade-off between access and scale, right? So because you've tried to build a school within 1 kilometer of every habitation, the typical school has only about 70 to 80 kids, right? And so in your current pupil-teacher ratio norm of 40-1, which is what you can afford when it comes to civil service teachers, you almost always have multi-grade teaching, where the same teacher is teaching multiple grades side by side. So when you have a contract teacher, a big part of what they're doing is just kind of taking their own grade, right? And going and sitting in a different part of the school so that they're providing more individual attention. So, in terms of the mechanics of the effectiveness of the contract teacher, I don't think the results are finding that they're more effective, right? It's finding that they're at least as effective, but they cost 1/5. So I think the question here is not to say that the civil service teachers somehow are bad, but rather to say that from if you are designing a cost-effective policy for how are you going to staff your schools, do you want one high-quality teacher from the cities? Like, I mean, because remember, the civil service teachers are being hired on a statewide competitive exam. So the students who pass that exam typically come from cities and come from better educated backgrounds because the objective standards on these tests are relatively high. But those are the same teachers who are the least willing to go locate in rural areas, right? So you've got to ask yourself if you have two models of teacher labor markets. One is I want the most qualified teacher, but I hire them on a state level labor market. They're not from the villages. They don't want to go there. And so when I post them to the village, they don't live there. They live 15 kilometers away because their own kids are in private schools in the district headquarters. And so then they have to travel using unreliable public transport, and they're absent 25% of the time, versus using kind of community teachers who have a high school degree, all right? And so the question is, how much education and training do you really need to teach grade 1 and grade 2 basic literacy? I think that's the main point. That when it comes to grade 9 math, at that point you can't substitute two low quality teachers, for one high quality teacher. But if you also look at the class size research that says the class size and individual attention matters the most when kids are young and when they're being socialized into the process of learning, then the policy question becomes, do I want to spend on one civil service teacher, or do I want to spend on 3 times as many, local community teachers that allows kids to get much more individual attention, at least in the first 3 grades of schooling, before they then get transitioned, into larger class sizes once they've been socialized into the process of learning, and once they have the basic literacy and numeracy that allows them to follow what's going on in the classroom, right? So I think that's the context. So another way to think about this is, so the civil service teacher is paid about 15,000 rupees a month, right? The contract teacher is paid about 1,500 rupees a month, right? And now the question is, who is this 1,500 rupee contract teacher? What is the supply side of this contract teachers? And it ends up being that a very large fraction of these teachers are educated young women, who have limited labor market opportunities outside the village, right? So the cultural norms in a lot of these areas would not allow a girl with a high school degree to go work outside their own village. So the only white collar job, that is commensurate with their high school education, is in fact being a community teacher. So it's something that, if you look at the history of, I think, education in the US, it's probably very similar, that the teaching profession got a large implicit subsidy from the lack of labor market opportunities for women outside teaching and nursing, right? So you could argue that rural India is kind of at a similar inflection point where you have a generation, you have had enough investment in education that you have 1 or 2 or 3. There's never a problem filling these jobs, that they exist. And so can you leverage that human capital in terms of providing more individual attention to kids in very early grades?
You're also suggesting some kind of cultural influence, right? That the local knowledge and so anyway. Thanks.
Yeah, so there's certainly some of that in the sense that, we have done, sorry, I didn't answer your question about qualitative work, right? So, I'm not a qualitative researcher, but we have teams of 25 full-time staff who worked with us for 5 years who spend a lot of time in the villages talking. And you certainly see that the contract teachers are significantly less absent, right? Now, the question is the mechanism for that the fact that they don't have tenure, or is it that they belong to the community? So we can't tease that apart. But it's a composite of the fact that they're drawn from the community and are accountable, but it's also easier for them to show up to work, right?
Thank you.
I could hand out the mic, but then he won't be able to see it. He apparently needs to see the face.
Hello, so my name is Jacqueline Barber, and I'm a human rights lawyer. I teach at the Law School and the Kennedy School and the School of Public Health. And I am not a quantitative person, but I have I'm doing some research on adolescent girls' education in India, and I have some reservations or some questions I'd like to ask you about what you said about teachers. So here's 2 questions. One is the question of incentives. So you said that monitoring works effectively to ensure higher attendance and so on, old-fashioned monitoring, I think was your phrase. Imagine if you had a situation, you talked about doctors as a parallel, the way doctors are taught. Imagine if you had a situation where doctors were given drugs which had no impact on any of their their patients. So they were sort of treating people who never got better, and it actually made no difference what they did to the patients because the patients never got better. However you taught the doctors, probably their incentive to show up to clinic would really disintegrate or would really decrease. So unless you sort of punish them and you say, well, if you don't come, you're not going to get paid. So I'm wondering whether it might be possible to think in a more sort of carrot rather than stick way here and think about what the incentives for most of us doing our jobs are. And part of the incentive is, of course, pay and our own living standards, but part of the incentive is some success in what we achieve. So if the textbooks are way beyond the level of the kids, if the kids are always bored, if the teacher's bored because nothing's happening in the classroom, whatever monitoring you use, even if the kids are the teachers in the classroom, is unlikely to make much of a difference. So what about thinking differently about the level of match between the kids' learning ability and what's expected of teachers? What about measuring performance in a different way? You talked about performance of teachers, but I didn't really hear you say that you'd measure performance in terms of incremental improvement in the kids' ability. And it seems to me that's what's critical here, because so far teachers are graded on exam results, on constant assessments, but those assessments don't really match or don't necessarily match what's going on in the village. So that's one question. The second related question is, don't you think the incentive of identification is partly what's happening with the contract teachers? I'm not a great fan of moving from a highly paid or relatively well-paid public service to just getting it more on the cheap, exploiting, maybe one could argue, the sort of gender bias in the system that, women can't travel, and so you exploit that, you pay them less, and you get what you want from that. That's not a model I'm very comfortable with. I'd be more comfortable with saying, if this is one of the most important investments that society can make, let's pay teachers well, but let's ensure that the way we set up the system is one where they can actually perform and get rewarded for performing. And one of those ways is, of course, identifying with the children. So if you have, teachers coming from urban areas to very poor rural settings, which are harsh and so on, and the kids half the time are in the fields, and the other half the time they don't understand what you're saying, then your identification with that learning exercise is pretty close to zero. But if you have teachers who are motivated by a social project, a social justice project, that's part of their training, not simply a sort of more technical training, then there would be a completely different level of investment. So I just wondered if you could comment on some of those points.
Great. No, in fact, one of the pities of having to do this so fast is that I couldn't tell you the details of how exactly we did the performance measurement and stuff for the teachers. So the project on attendance was in fact a different one. What we did in terms of performance pay in Andhra Pradesh was do exactly what you suggested, which is measure the improvement of every child and essentially recognize and reward teachers for that. And that dovetails quite nicely with what you said about motivation, right? What is it that motivates us? And it's certainly not just carrots and sticks, but a sense of intrinsic motivation of a job well done. A certain standards of excellence. I'll send you these papers and you can look at them and you'll see that we spend a lot of time. In fact, before conceptualizing this project on performance pay, this was done when I was a grad student at Harvard, and we presented this at 4 different workshops, including development economics, labor economics, organizations, and behavior, precisely to get a lot of these other aspects of intrinsic motivation into our design. So the most kind of interesting snippet to tell you is the following, which is if you looked at the data we had from teacher absenteeism, you found that the teachers with the highest job satisfaction were in fact the teachers who were the most absent. Okay. And that's kind of, and that seems quite perverse, right? Till you go talk to the teachers. And what you find is that just the system is completely demotivating to people who work hard and who are not recognized for that. So if you get your salary without showing up to work, you're remarkably satisfied with that job, right? And so in many ways, what the performance pay was trying to do was doing exactly what you're suggesting, which is it was a very small amount of money, right? It's not a large amount of money, right? But it was precisely about recognizing and rewarding effective teaching in a way that is consistent with teachers' own professional self-identification of what it means to be a good teacher, right? So, and we are professors, and I'm in the University of California. We have probably even more bureaucratic requirements, than you might have in a private school. And my rule of thumb here is don't impose on teachers anything that I don't want imposed on myself, okay? And so one way to think about this is that we resent micromanaging on domains of professional expertise. So if somebody were to tell us, like, I mean, this is how you need to be, doing something that you know a lot more about, that's demotivating. On the other hand, we welcome a certain amount of professional differentiation based on achievement that is commensurate with our idea of what it means to be a good researcher, our idea of what it means to be a good faculty member. So just like you don't want bureaucratic intrusion, it's also demotivating to have a lot of dead wood and colleagues who are not being very productive, right? So I think the larger point here is creating the culture, like you said, of achievement, and this is a very small piece of that, right? So certainly by no means am I suggesting that this is the only thing, but rather when you look at how moribund the system is, that you basically, once the day you join from the day you retire, in those 35 years, there's really nothing in your professional career that depends on what you do, right? Like, I mean, and so really hard to maintain a culture. And I agree with everything you say, right? I mean, the question is how do you maintain that in a large impersonal bureaucracy of millions of teachers where people are just punching in the clock? So which then gets me to your second question, in terms of is the social connection a part of what's going on with the contract teachers? And that's exactly right. So Geeta Gandhi King did. So one of the perverse unintended consequences of paying very high salaries, right? Now, we could argue about what's a high salary and what's a low salary, but at some level you have to use the market as a benchmark because what you pay affects the entire dynamics of the market. So what's going on when you pay salaries, the civil service teachers who are paid 5 times or 7 times or 10 times once you count the discounted value of their retirement benefits, right? Is when you're paid that much, the social distance between the teacher and the villagers is so large that there's nobody in the village, like, I mean, who's commensurate with that teacher's social status. And so the teacher then chooses to live in the city where they have peers and they have a similar socioeconomic peer group. And so in a perverse way, like the high salaries are almost exacerbating that social distance, right? So this is not to suggest that you want to underpay. Of course you want to pay well, and of course you want to pay well relative to what the market wage is, but I think part of the problem with teacher salaries, and this is my favorite parlor game in Delhi or Bombay, if I want to prove how disconnected the Indian elites are, like, I mean, from what's actually going on in the country. So my favorite parlor game is to ask people a question as to what do you think is the salary ratio between a public and private school teacher in India? And most people will not only get it wrong, but they'll get it wrong by a factor of 10, right? Because the median answer I'll get is that the private school teacher gets paid about 1.5 to 2 times more. And that's because these are people in a demographic of Campion and Cathedral and Delhi Public School and Modern School, like, I mean, which is a set of elite private schools representing the top 0.01% of the country. Whereas if you look at the average data on public and private schools, the average public school teacher in India is paid about 4 to 5 times more than what the market wage for that job is. Now, I agree overall that paying good salaries and creating a strong professional trajectory is an important part of long-term development, but those numbers cannot be divorced from what's going on in the market. So to kind of answer the question, coming back to the way you put it, do I agree that a big part of the effectiveness of the contract teacher is their connection to the community? Yes. Do I think that the right policy question is not how much can I underpay teachers? No. But if I'm paying 5 times or 10 times what the market wage is, it's what's the most one can deliver for these kids in terms of using local resources better. And again, I didn't mean to suggest anything along the lines of saying you exploit women's limited labor market opportunities outside. If anything, for the women in the village, I mean, this is the most empowering thing they've done in their lives in terms of both employment as well as role model effects in the village. So let me stop there.
Yeah, we gave you a little hint there, Karthik.
Yes, thanks.
Karthik, China has looked at, a somewhat different model to what you were suggesting, because we all know it's very hard.
Sorry, China?
Yeah, so we all know it's very hard to get people to move from the cities, or people who get a college degree to move into a rural setting to go teach. So one is they're investing much more heavily in creating boarding schools in the countryside. I forget the exact numbers, but over a third of children in rural China now go to boarding school. And you also create some critical mass, because the Indian rural schools are tiny, the teachers live in isolation, they're teaching to 5 grade levels at the same time. It's an extremely complex situation. So that's one. And secondly, they've created a number of incentives. So your teacher education, if you go to a normal university, there's a free normal policy where you get a free ride and you get an extra incentive to go out and teach in the countryside, and you're actually bound to do so for a certain period of time. I think it's 5 years or something like that. So what are your views on something like that versus deprofessionalizing the profession and looking at contract teachers who are don't have the same, educational qualifications, subject matter knowledge, the degree, etc.
No, so I think this is a great question, and it highlights exactly what I said in terms of the trade-off between access and scale, right? So the moment you want scale, then you're kind of either saying that the children come and live here, right? Or that they're going to travel much longer distances. So part of the policy trade-off that India made was to say we want a school within a kilometer of every habitation, and so you have this current status quo, right? Now, if you were to reinvent the entire system, could you do better by creating larger schools, more resources, more fixed facilities, more infrastructure, single grade teaching, more training, more support? The answer is yes. But would you be able to get the same increases in enrollment if parents had to let their children travel that much further? That's kind of where it gets trickier, right? So the other part of China, which is of course different, is that they also have a much more coercive state in terms of its ability to get people to show up, and do things of that sort. So I don't mean to suggest, so one thing I want to be very clear, when I'm talking about contract teachers, I am not talking about deprofessionalizing education, right? I think that would be a big mistake. And I think a lot of people have a visceral reaction to say, are you suggesting that training doesn't matter? Are you suggesting we just need to throw a lot of low-cost bodies at the problem? That's in fact not what I'm suggesting. I think what I'm suggesting is that if you have a status quo policy of a regular teacher norm of 40:1, you could dramatically cost-effectively scale your ability to reach and provide additional supplemental instruction to younger children by providing every regular teacher with, say, a teacher's aide, right? Call them a teaching assistant. Make it a 4-year track, right? Whereby you say that over these 4 years, you are a teaching assistant, sort of like a medical assistant, sort of how an intern does rounding with an attending, right? And then you're getting modular training for 3 months every summer. And then at the end of those 4 years, you're going to take a high quality teacher eligibility test. Of the sort that 90% of our current regular teachers are failing, right? But you're going to get credit for the years you have served as a teaching assistant. You're going to have had ongoing learning on the job, and then you're going to pass a high absolute standard. So it's just that instead of saying once you pass the standard, you're a teacher, you're kind of putting this teaching requirement of 3 or 4 years as kind of an apprenticeship process. And then at the end of it, you might find you're just a really bad fit to be a teacher, in which case, you kind of choose a different profession as opposed to getting in and then having this lifelong mismatch between your interest, ability, and what you're doing. So I do think there's a way to finesse this that leverages kind of the local advantage, the cost advantage, and kind of builds a career ladder as opposed to thinking about this as deprofessionalizing teaching.
Thanks.
Let me just, we're a little bit over time. So thank you, Karthik, for the effervescent conversation. Much appreciated. And I don't know if you're not going to stick around, right?
Well, yeah, I think for the first half an hour, I'd like to kind of, at least I'll turn the video off so you're not subjected to my face. But maybe I'll stay dialed in to the first half an hour of the next session.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And